Biotech follow-on financings have been getting out with some upsizing on the back of good data. And we're also seeing IPOs get out on NASDAQ. But will geopolitics scuttle this new momentum? We'll discuss the capital markets for biotech on this week's BioCentury This Week podcast. Plus, late-stage epilepsy data from Xenon are reviving the biotech stock and the KV7 target. And in our rare disease spotlight, we'll take a look at what's in the pipeline for Friedreich's Ataxia. I'm Jeff Cranmer, host of the BioCentury This Week podcast, and joining me today are my colleagues
Stephen Hansen, Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
Selena Koch, Executive Editor.
And Danielle Golovin, Senior Biopharma Analyst.
Well, we've just wrapped our 5th East-West Biopharma Summit in Seoul. I am back in the Bay Area and deeply jet-lagged, but very impressed with what is happening in Seoul and in Daejeon around biotech. Good energy. It's really starting to buzz. We had investors and companies from all over Asia, from Europe, from Canada, from the US, checking out what is happening in Seoul. And there really does seem to be good energy there. So look for more out of Korea. You could check out our recent coverage. We took a look at some neurology companies that are starting to make their mark, raising significant venture capital. And we're also starting to see some Korean biotech set up shop in Japan at the iPark Center. That's a former Takeda site. You can check out more on the special edition of the podcast that we recorded live on stage at the event. It was the final event of the conference, and we put that out on Friday, so you can get thoughts from 2 of the attendees from the conference, as well as Josh and Simone, and it's well worth checking out. And now BioCentury's energy turns to BioEquity Europe, right, Stephen? That'll be in Prague. Yeah. You'll be taking the podcast on the road in Prague, yeah?
That's right. But I wanted to ask you, Jeff, so what was your favorite food that you had while you were in Seoul?
Galbi. I probably had galbi twice a day.
What is, I'm sorry, I'm a little naive. What is galbi?
Yeah, galbi. It's grilled ribs, and they sort of set up a nice, like, either hot coals right on the table in front of you, or, you know, some other contraption, and they cook it right there for you. Goes down very well with insert delicious Korean beer of your choice. Korean beer is very, very light, which is somewhat dangerous. And a little bit of soju, and of course, kimchi with every meal. That was definitely the way to go. But yeah, I snuck out many times and got some good galbi. All right, Stephen, there's a war going on, and I am curious. You know, you've been watching the markets. You had your 2026 preview. You said that Biotech's back this time. It's for real.
I did. Yep.
We've been seeing some follow-ons. Companies have been upsizing the follow-ons based on good data. Xenon, latest example. A couple of IPOs have gotten out. And what's this geopolitical turmoil going to do to that positive vibe we've been seeing in the biotech markets?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So the very short summary is it's kind of good news and bad news, I think, right? So as you mentioned, follow-ons are still getting done. Often it's on the back of positive catalysts, but I think we've seen a few opportunistic deals get done as well. Again, as you mentioned, we saw 2 deals get substantially upsized last week, which is that's a really good indicator for investor demand, particularly generalist demand, because, when deals get upsized 150, 200 million, usually those are pretty large checks that are going into those deals. So that's a good sign. So just kind of looking at the numbers, kind of where things stand for the quarter, I know we still have a couple weeks to go here, but there's been over $7 billion raised so far in the first quarter of 2026 for follow-ons. And, kind of relative to where we were last year, that's actually really good. That's almost as much as was raised in the entirety of the first half of 2025. From that perspective, thumbs up. I think it's pretty positive sign. We've had 7 IPOs on NASDAQ so far. Only 3 of those are right now above issue price. So kind of mixed performance in kind of this first group that's come out. And the last three have been underwater. Two of those were multi-billion-dollar valuations at the IPO. So you can discuss whether you think that that is an issue around valuation or what have you. But the numbers aren't as good for venture financing, at least not to this point. So industry has raised about $5.4 billion in private financings so far this year. I'm sure a few more deals will come in before the end of the quarter, but if that number were to hold, it would be the lowest aggregate for biotech venture raised in a quarter since, anybody want to guess? Jeff, you want to guess? Give me a year.
A year.
Yeah. Danielle, Selena, you guys can chime in too. Give me your best guess.
2008. I'm going to go way back.
Selena, what do you think?
Dang, I know we've done these analyses before. I can't counter it. Pre-COVID.
Don't cheat. Yeah. Okay. Danielle, what do you think?
I was going to say 2018.
Ooh, I think Danielle wins. So if this number holds, it would be the lowest quarter for venture money raised since 2017. Wow. So 9 years or so.
But by how far, Stephen?
Not a lot. I mean, it's not bad.
Yeah.
You know, it's not.
Yeah.
This isn't. It's not. We're not talking like desert type of. No money at all getting raised. But it's sort of noticeable if you look back over the years, over the quarters. There's a fairly steady kind of baseline that you kind of see, and then you get these little spurts where you get a lot of money being raised, but then it kind of will revert back to that kind of baseline. And this is tucking in below kind of that kind of 10-year baseline, I would say. You're right to point that out. It's not. I'm not, calling the death knell of private financing here, but it's noticeable that it's, below that, given how well things were going in the second half of the year.
Yeah, but do you think it's sort of like we often see public markets sort of when you are in a recovering faster. There's like a lag in the venture side.
You're right. Yep, and that's probably part of what's happening here. Is we're probably partly seeing a lag here. It could also just be. And this isn't very much me talking off the top of my head here now without any reporting to go to this. But I also wonder if the fact that we had started to hear that there was a bit more competition in deals, there were more people vying to get into some deals. I'm just wondering if valuations are starting to creep up, if maybe some investors are being a little more maybe selective in what they're doing as opposed to the last couple of years where, I think valuations were maybe bit more attractive for VCs, and so something that we can maybe dig into and see if something like that's at play. But thought it was an interesting thing that kind of jumped out at the numbers to me. But to come back to what Jeff was saying about then how kind of the geopolitics sort of plays into this, and that's I think where when you look at the XBI, so it's largely kind of trading flat so far this year, which relative to tech and the S&P 500, that's actually not bad because those are both trading down so far year to date.
And the XBI had a very good year last year, right?
And that's right. Yep, it did. But there was also, going into the year, there was every expectation that, that was going to continue. But I think that sort of lackluster performance, I think all of this is just sort of due to the macroeconomic kind of chaos, right? That's kind of hit the markets. And there's several different levels of this. I think it's beyond just what we're seeing from the conflict in Iran. There are fears that private credit markets, could sort of implode and potentially lead to a recession. Obviously, you've got oil prices, that could trigger a return of inflation. That in turn puts more pressure on the Fed with regard to interest rates. So I think all those things are sort of playing in the background and making this really just a lot more volatile. And, I think it's the same thing we saw right around when the Ukraine-Russia war started, was just the increased volatility just made things a lot tougher. And so I anticipate that until there's some maybe closure on this, that's probably going to continue. And obviously, I think we have the Fed decision this week as well. So we should maybe get some hints from them on kind of how they're thinking about this. Although obviously Powell is going to be stepping down in May. So that may be interesting to see how the new chair kind of approaches rates and inflation if this conflict kind of draws on and inflation gets a bit sticky. Yeah, I think that's sort of the downside to where things stand, and maybe why wouldn't be a surprise if there was a bit of maybe a lull in some of that financing activity over the next month or two, just as people wait to kind of see where things land.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Stephen. I know you're beginning to put out calls for your 2Q public markets preview, so we'll get an update in a few weeks. And let's turn now to talk about one of these companies that's upsized on some good data, Xenon, as we mentioned at the top. Selena, you took a look at Xenon and, well, last week's phase 3 focal epilepsy readout sent its shares up 50%. What was significant here about these data, Selena?
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I'll just start by saying it was a good week for Xenon in addition to that 50% bump. On Monday, at the end of the day, they then proposed a $500 million follow-on. By Tuesday night, they had priced at actually $650 million. And by Thursday night, the underwriters had exercised their allotment in full, their over allotment in full. So it ended up being close to $750 million. So good job for them. What was it that pleased investors so much? This readout was for a molecule that's an opener of a particular kind of voltage-gated potassium channel. It's called KV7. And the readout really kind of cemented its comeback story. This isn't the first molecule to go after that target. GSK had a drug approved in 2011, pretty sure it was. But, over some years, it ultimately ended up being withdrawn from the market over safety concerns. In the retina, for instance, there were abnormalities that even brought a risk of blindness. It was turning people's skin blue. So pigmentation changes, hair, skin, nails, things like that. And so what Xenon has done here is taken a mechanism that should be effective because there's validation for it. And they've created on a new kind of chemical structure that prevents dimerization because it turned out that dimerization was kind of the thing that was causing the trouble. And now that's borne out with phase 3 data. So in its phase 3 study, it reduced median monthly seizure frequency by over 42% relative to placebo. So that's a big drop. That was highly statistically significant, even outperformed the company's own phase 2 data.
I was going to say, Selena, I was just impressed by the p-value. I think there are
Yes.
11 zeros and then a 6. I mean, it was
Zero, my hero. Yeah, that's I don't even think I can count that high. But
that said, there are some side effects with this particular mechanism that I think you can never avoid, like altogether. It is a small molecule, right? So it's going all over the brain. And if you open up this potassium channel, from a mechanistic point of view, what you're doing is you're allowing potassium ions to flow out of the neuron. This sort of stabilizes its membrane potential it makes it a little harder to fire an action potential. Okay, so what you want to do then as a company is you want to do that just enough to counteract that hyperexcitability that drives a seizure, but not too much because you get dizziness, sleepiness, somnolence. And we've seen that with this mechanism across multiple programs. Basically, it just requires careful dosing. And so one thing they did was, they extended the half-life such that it can be just dosed once a day, and then they give it in the evening. So basically, you take it, you go to bed, and if you have any of that somnolence or dizziness or whatever, it's happening while you're sleeping. So that kind of helped to get around that issue as well.
all right, Selena, what's next?
Well, Xenon plans to submit its NDA to FDA in the third quarter of this year, so that is coming. And then, in addition, they're testing it in not only focal onset, but generalized tonic-clonic seizures and in some psychiatric disorders where depression is prevalent. So major depressive disorder, bipolar depression. They say they think it has antidepressive effects, which they anticipate could help it differentiate even in epilepsy. So yes, the main objective here is reducing seizure frequency, but they're also testing these other psychiatric symptom domains. There are a lot of drugs one can take to mitigate seizures, right? There's a lot on the market. There's generic. Having something that can also address depressive symptoms, because these patients with intractable epilepsy tend to have that, could just be another differentiator to add to that profile. So we'll be seeing some data on those symptoms, both inside epilepsy and then independently as well in the future.
All right. And also following the pattern that Xenon had last week was Dianthus. The company met an interim goal for one of its polyneuropathy programs. Shares rose by more than 20%, and the company proposed a $400 million offering. by the end of the week, it was close to 720 with an upsize and the green shoe coming home. Quite a good week for Xenon and Dianthus, so hats off. Well, we have something new for you here at BioCentury, and here to tell you about it is Selena. Selena,
Oh,
we have a
yes.
new feature in our BCIQ database.
We sure do. So those of you who have access to BCIQ, you know you can search for products in there, in addition to deals and financings and all the other kinds of data in the database. Well, now you can also search for discontinued products. This is something that a lot of people have asked for over the years. We've wanted it internally as analysts of the industry. So to give like one example of what you can do with this, last week, we published a package of stories on pulmonary fibrosis. So there's this wave of phase 2 programs, 20-something phase 2 programs, right, approaching proof of concept, lots of different targets there. And so we look back a little bit between the era of the first 2 approvals and the 10 years that elapsed between Boehringer's recent approval last year, and said, okay, well, how many programs were discontinued and what were they targeting? And then we counted up, number of programs per target, compared it directly to this current phase 2 wave, and you could see kind of a marked target evolution. There's just a lot of new targets that haven't been tried before in the pipeline right now. A few are still carryovers from this earlier era. And if you're curious about them, what they are, you can dig into them in a story. In that story package, this particular one was from our colleague, Lindsay Martin.
All right. Yeah, it's good stuff. So hopefully we'll fuel future stories in BioCentury. We're going to take a quick break and then we'll come back to talk rare diseases with Danielle.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by the 26th BioEquity Europe in Prague, Czech Republic. Innovators everywhere are seeing speed as the driver of investment, partnering and success, speed to the clinic, speed to early human data, speed to de-risk assets. The question for European biotechs is clear. How do you compete in this arena? Facing new momentum from Asia and an unpredictable landscape in the US, the science in Europe is there. There are more experienced operators. And investor sentiment finally is turning. What's needed now is speed. In its 26th edition, BioEquity Europe travels to Central and Eastern Europe for the first time to explore emerging opportunities in the region and debate how European biotech can accelerate to compete and lead in today's world. Join us in Prague, May 4th to 6th for this destination event for investors and biopharma leaders. Register at bioequityeurope.com. BioEquity Europe, where Europe accelerates to compete.
Okay, we are back. Danielle, you took a close look at Friedreich's Ataxia. What did you learn about what's in the pipeline?
Well, Jeff, I believe our style is Friedreich Ataxia, no S.
Man, I've been hammering people about that for years, and look at you just getting me.
As I learned from you in our style channel.
That's a nice throwdown. I much respect, Danielle.
Yeah, so I did a deep dive into, I'm just going to call it FA for our talk here. So
yeah,
Friedreich
I think that's a good way to roll.
So this disease is caused by a trinucleotide repeat expansion in a gene called frataxin, and this has to do with mitochondria. So mitochondria use iron for energy production, as you all know, since mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. I had to get that in there because it's in all the textbooks. So frataxin helps keep this mitochondrial iron in a usable, non-toxic form. So this limits iron overload and downstream reactive oxygen species generation. Without frataxin, this increases oxidative stress, the mitochondria produce less energy, cells get tired, and eventually they die. Most affected cells in this disease are typically the heart, the pancreas, and the brain, and this causes cardiomyopathy, diabetes, and ataxia.
So people have been going out FA in different ways over the years. What's happening with the pipeline right now?
Yeah, the pipelines is definitely shifting from the early pipeline was sort of just stabilizing the mitochondria. Now it's shifting towards gene therapies to actually restore the gene itself. So delivering frataxin. The field, FA has one approved drug, Skyclarys, and this switches on an antioxidant defense to, increase mitochondrial energy production and reduce those reactive oxygen species. Basically, the first-gen drugs help the cells cope with the mitochondrial stress caused by frataxin deficiency, whereas the incoming pipeline is more these gene therapies to, supply the gene. And the leading gene therapy, and there are at least 5, LX2006 from Lexeo Therapeutics is leader. It's being tested in FA-associated cardiomyopathy. As I mentioned, the heart cells are very affected by this disease, and unfortunately, this is the leading cause of death in these patients, is cardiomyopathy. But they did have positive results in October, and that led to conversations with FDA to agree to an accelerated approval pathway.
I think that's like potentially a very important development for this field, right? Anytime you can get agreement on what could constitute an approvable endpoint for accelerated approval. So what are they looking at there as the endpoint?
So in this case, since they're targeting FA-induced cardiomyopathy, they're using, a measure of heart function. So in this particular case, they're using left ventricular mass index, or LVMI, in addition to frataxin expression.
So among the gene therapies, Danielle, are they all AAV-based? Are they kind of similar to each other? Or are there kind of key differences?
Yeah, the one big difference that came out to me as I was reviewing these programs, so there's 5 that I identified, and 4 out of the 5 are using AAVs to deliver the gene. But the sort of unique one in that case was Replay Holdings and its spin-out company, Calib, I don't know if I'm saying that right, Calib, are using herpes simplex viruses, so HSV, as vectors. And their big claim is that it has a high payload capacity. And while the frataxin gene itself isn't huge, like DMD or anything, if you want to give its full regulatory elements, then that's going to exceed an AAV's 5 kilobase payload capacity. And so that's their advantage there, is that they can deliver a large construct in its sort of native form with its regulatory elements. That's a bit of the landscape on FA. And we also looked out on the innovation horizon a bit to highlight a few papers with insights into new avenues for treating FA. So check those out in BioCentury's Science Spotlights.
This too makes me wonder, Danielle, if this is a place where, brain shuttles applied to those capsids could really help. Of course, you want to treat the cardiac problems lead to death, but it's a multifactorial disease that definitely has a lot of, CNS issues.
Oh, right. Yeah. So Voyager and partner Neurocrine have a preclinical gene therapy that's utilizing an IV-delivered AAV capsid discovered by Voyager that uses an ALPL-mediated transcytosis pathway to cross the BBB and deliver frataxin broadly across the CNS. And other programs may have innovative methods to enhance CNS exposure, which could include other BBB crossing mechanisms or a more direct route of administration.
All right, Danielle, thanks for that deep dive. What's next in the rare disease spotlight, or are you still picking among a few choices?
I always have a list going. If anyone has any suggestions, throw them my way.
Yeah, that would be great. We always love hearing from our listeners. And if you're liking what you're hearing on the BioCentury This Week podcast, don't forget to subscribe, give us a rating. I guess it works differently depending on your platform, but always eager to hear from you. And it was great being in Seoul and meeting some of our listeners in Seoul and elsewhere in Asia. So good to know that we've got a broad reach. All right, thanks for tuning in. We will be back next week with another edition of the BioCentury This Week podcast, and look out for our sister podcast, The BioCentury Show. Selena will be in conversation with Najat Khan from Recursion. Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for BioCentury This Week. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.